welcome to a special Paddle and Portage news update where we bring you the up-to-date topics around news that affects wilderness and wilderness travel. Today, the topic we're discussing is the RABC Remote Area Border Crossing, a permit obtained through the Canadian government to be able to cross from the boundary waters, in this case, into Quetico for the sake of wilderness travel. And it is in question. Joe Fredericks, tell us what's going on.
Well, what we know happened is that on September 25th, the Canada Border Services Agency did what they're saying is a pause. That's the word they're really focusing on, is we've paused issuing new or renewing RABC permits. And that's brought up a lot of questions, concern from people who own property on the Canadian side of Saginaw or travel across the border lakes back and forth, people who enter through the Cache Bay Ranger Station at the end of the Gunflint Trail, people on the Ely side who use RABCs, and this goes from Grand Portage, Lake Superior, all the way over to Lake of the Woods. So this isn't just like a Gunflint SAG thing. This is a huge area that impacts a lot of people who use these permits, and the fact the Canadian government won't say if they're suspended, if the program's going to end, if they're just reviewing it and they're going to make some adjustments. All of those are possibilities. We just don't know, and they won't give me a straight answer, which as a journalist is proving to be somewhat frustrating, going through the process and speaking with officials from the Canada Border Services Agency. I've spoke with numerous officials from there now, most recently on November 19th with Luke Reimer, a spokesperson for CBSA, and he said something that stood out a little bit more than the other comments that I've heard from multiple other officials in this agency, including in Ottawa. I've spoken with officials in Thunder Bay and in Ottawa about this. And what Luke told me on November 19th is that part of the review of this RABC program includes dynamics focused on ensuring the safety, security, and prosperity of Canada. So, what does that mean for people who are U.S. citizens and have used RABC permits for a long time, when they're saying that we're reviewing it because we're focused on ensuring the prosperity and safety and security of Canada? What's that mean?
To me, it sounds like they are perceiving a potential threat to that prosperity, or at least they're taking under consideration potential border threats.
That's a possibility. It's also just a possibility that they want to make sure that the financial side of it makes sense for them issuing RBCs. I mean, they're only like $30 to process. It's a very easy thing to obtain if you have a pretty fairly clean background as far as legal matters are concerned. Like, we've each gotten RABCs for years now and used them, and it's something that I do online now. I mean, it's easier than getting a driver's license, certainly, and certainly much easier than getting a passport. If you have one, you need to have a passport in order to get an RABC. But, so it could just be that. Like, we don't want to read too much into those statements. Prosperity, safety, security. I mean, that's where we start to think about the November election from earlier this month and possibilities of migrants and asylum seekers and people leaving the U.S. and going to Canada who are undocumented and so forth. Like, there's that whole rhetoric that enters into this when you start talking about safety, security, and the border. But we don't know that. We don't know that because the Canadian government won't tell us. They just keep using these pretty vague statements that they're sending, not just to me, a member of the press, but they're sending that to Quetico Park Superintendent Trevor Gibb, who I also spoke with, actually, again, corresponded with Trevor on November 20th. And he's saying, all I know is the same stuff. They're telling me the same thing they're telling you. And, he's kind of starting to scratch his head a bit and going, well, let's just, hopefully we get some answers on this. And right now, if you have an RABC that is valid, mine expires, I think, in late February. Mine's still valid, still is in effect until it expires. So they're not canceling them outright. They're not even using the word suspended. But if it expires in late February and they haven't lifted the pause, I won't be able to get a new one. The same as some property owners that I talked to who own cabins on the Canadian side of SAG. Theirs actually expire in November and December coming up. They'd be up for renewal. And as it stands right now, they won't be able to get those renewed. So there's definitely some timeliness in that element. People use it to snowmobile the corridor up on SAG and other lakes to cross into Canada. And what it means when we say cross in, you aren't going to a customs. You're not even telling anybody necessarily that you are now in Canada. That's what the RABC does. It allows you to come and go more fluidly than going through at Pigeon River or at International Falls and these other, where there's an actual kiosk and you engage with a customs person coming and going. The RABC, at least entering Canada, sort of eliminates that. So it's a big deal. If you are interested in this topic, which a lot of people are, it's a big deal. And if you don't know about it, if you've never used an RABC, if you're not crossing into Canada remotely like a lot of people do here in the Boundary Waters, what's the big deal? I can just paddle on a Seagull or Brule, Sawbill. What the heck? Doesn't mean anything to those lakes at all. Zero impact.
So at this point, a lot of the outcomes of this pause are conjecture. We don't know much about where this is going to go. However, we do know who it could potentially impact. If there is a large change, that's folks with cross-the-border residences or seasonal residences or even businesses. And specifically in this case, anybody traveling in a way across the border that doesn't involve Customs and Border Patrol. You reached out to Stu Osthoff to inquire as to his potential thoughts and feelings around the impact of this pause, and want to maybe share his response and why his response is related, how it's related to this.
Yeah, Stu runs the Boundary Waters Journal. He also guides the Grand Slam guide service up in Quetico, and he wasn't concerned about RABCs unless it impacted his business. He had some thoughts then, but otherwise he just said, actually kind of good riddance to the program if that's the case, because for whatever reason, that's why Stu feels that way, but it's not as big a deal to him because he, over there at that spot where he goes through into Canada over toward on the west side of the wilderness, there's still an entry point, so to say, crossing the border. So he doesn't see it from his lens as a big of a deal. But you ask somebody trying to get into Cache Bay if it's a big deal, and it's a huge deal. Or like Donnie Sorley, who owns Chippewa Inn on an island on the Canadian side of SAG and recently bought it just within the past couple years. And they're trying to rent out cabins to guests who motor up the corridor and then cross into Canada with an RABC permit. If that isn't available, their impact to the business is going to be huge, because the only other way to get there is to cross at Pigeon River, then take these gnarly roads to get to Northern Light Lake, and then you can get into SAG from there. But even that is a cumbersome and time-consuming and difficult process where you need certain vehicles to do that, basically.
Joe, I know you don't have any authority to speak to what I'm about to ask you, but if this is taken to the extreme, does this have the capacity to, say, eliminate the need for the ranger station that Peter is posted on currently in the summertime?
Peter and Stacy up at Cache Bay?
Exactly.
Well, I asked Trevor about that specifically, Trevor Gibb, the superintendent up in Quetico. What's this going to mean for Cache Bay if there aren't any? And being a government employee himself, Trevor didn't want to dive into hypotheticals because it's just too early to tell. But there's some precedent here. The RABCs were temporarily suspended during COVID, and so during 2020 and part of 2021, they weren't there, and the ranger station was not open because nobody was going to be primarily getting in there. Our buddy Kevin the K-Man Kramer, who goes to Quetico a lot and uses RABCs or has in the past knows that you can still fly in to Cache Bay from the north side of the park. That's an option to get into Quetico, is that way. You could take this roundabout way and that I'm talking about through Northern Light, or get it on SAG another way from Canada. You're not crossing from the U.S. on water to get there, but you're coming from land on the Canadian side. So there's still ways to access Cache Bay. You could also even paddle up through these other lakes over way far to the west, but that's just getting into dramatic territory. You're probably going to need an RABC. And, yes, technically there might be a reason to have Cache Bay open, but if RABCs go away, I would start to think, this is hypothetical, more like seasonal cabin where the backcountry rangers are using it. Other people for park maintenance and stuff are coming around, but you wouldn't need Peter and Stacy at the helm, probably, would be my assumption.
Right, and that would also apply to a place like Prairie Portage, any of those remotely staffed with Quetico Rangers for the sake of permitting. So potential far-reaching consequences, although also potential small hiccup in what is otherwise business as usual. We just don't know yet. There is a full article on this at paddleandportage.com where Joe fleshes out some of the different perspectives and possibilities on this issue, and we will be bringing you updates as we learn them, posted to the website and as we can here on this podcast forum.
That's right. We've got 2 articles now from the past. So I think the first one came on the 11th or the 12th of November, and now the most recent one was posted on the 19th, late in the afternoon on the 19th, after speaking with the officials at the Canadian side of this, as I was describing earlier, Luke from the Customs on the Canadian side. But I've also spoke with U.S. officials about this too, senators. I've emailed with Amy Klobuchar's office, as well as speaking multiple times with officials from Representative in Congress, the 8th Congressional District. Pete Stauber is our congressman. I've talked with his staff specifically about this, and they're feeling the same thing. They've said, I've called our contacts at the Canadian consulate in Minneapolis. I've spoke with officials in Parliament in Ontario about it and saying, hey, what can you guys help me out with? And they're not getting any response either. That's the frustrating part for everybody, I think, right now. Not just me as a member of the press, not just Trevor at the superintendent in Quetico, not the Canadian SAG property owners, not Donnie Sorley, not even Stu Osthoff. The frustrating thing for everybody across the board is that we aren't getting tangible, clear answers. And that's what we want, of course. This isn't something that just happened last week. That's when I broke the news, so to say, essentially, about it after I got a tip from somebody that owns property on the Canadian side of SAG going, what the F? Help us out here, Joe. What's going on? But this, as I said, actually went on pause in late September. So we're looking at 2 months now that these things have been on pause. That is a significant amount of time. And for the Canadian side to still, after 2 months, not be able to say exactly why these are on pause and being reviewed, that's an issue. That's a problem. It's frustrating for everybody involved. Give us some answers, is the general rhetoric from everybody across the board that I've been talking to.
Well, I know, Joe, you will be bringing those answers as soon as you can find them. In the meantime, we will continue to wait and watch, and folks can still apply for an RABC, although the processing of those is currently really not happening at the moment. Why don't we have other news to discuss on this update, specifically lighter-hearted, which is the upcoming 2025 Canoecopia, the Paddle Sports Expo in Madison, Wisconsin, which is dated now for March 7th through the 9th. If you're unfamiliar with that, it's put on by Rutabaga Paddle Sports in Madison, good pal of the podcast and Paddle and Portage, Darren Bush. This is an important time in regards to Canoecopia. Why does this time matter?
Well, now's the time to get your tickets, for one thing, to go to Canoecopia and to start thinking about your lodging, booking your hotels, that corridor, that main area by the Alliant Energy Center. Those hotels book up fast. We found that out one year. We didn't book our room in time, basically. We were sort of like, what are we going to do? And ended up sort of in the outskirts, or we finagled something at the last minute to sort of dodge that scene. But now's the time to book your hotels in Madison and be close to Alliant. That's what we like to do. We like to walk over there. And also get your tickets to the event itself. Like, you get tickets, passes to get into Canoecopia. Now is the time to get that lined up, just so it doesn't sell out, and just so that you're able to go for sure and get it on the calendar and start planning. We're going to be there. We booked our travel plans and made all the accommodations and stuff just last week, so we're ready to get back to Canoecopia this year. Very excited to be there. We have a robust presence this year at Canoecopia. Paddle and Portage will be, so we're excited. But we're just planting the seed for you, the paddling community, to get over to Canoecopia in Madison March 7th through the 9th, as you said, LB, and just get things on track for kicking off the 2025 paddling season, which, we're still not even iced in up here in the Boundary Waters yet. But it's time to start thinking and planning for Canoecopia. Start doing that now.
For those of you who may not have been before, Canoecopia is not just an expo. Many folks show up there to find deals on gear, to purchase things at often a discounted price that's special for Canoecopia, but also to get to meet a lot of the folks that have set up shop at the expo, the makers, the sellers, the guide services. There's just such a variety there across the region. Last year I met a woman, Sandra, who owns an instruction and guiding company over on the Wolf River, which allowed me to eventually end up down there for a whitewater canoeing instructional course. And so it's also a place to meet people from the paddling community and really expand the paddling network, both professionally and personally. I ended up paddling with a couple of guys at that clinic that now are pals. So it's a really amazing event, not to mention the speakers and the clinics that happen.
And you also got to meet, we shared a booth next to our buddy Pete, and you're wearing a patch of his on your cap today from Pete Brodigam's Expedition Works, and just that great company. We got to spend time with them. Then we connected with him at the Camping Symposium. He was on a recent episode talking about falling through the ice. So it's all about those connections that you make at Canoecopia in addition to the gear itself. So get your tickets now. Plan your trip to Canoecopia in Madison in March, early March, 7th through the 9th. And we're already talking about it and getting excited to get over there ourselves.
Yeah, and if you have a story to share from Canoecopia, obviously we want to hear it. Connections made, things learned. We always love hearing from you, our listeners, and special thanks to you all for tuning in.